अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, मैं हूं डॉक्टर शुजात। आप देख रहे हैं प्रोग्राम लाइव वायर। प्रोग्राम के इस हिस्से में हमने आज बात करनी है बैंकिंग सेक्टर के बारे में। नाज़रीन, आज हमारे साथ एक बड़े स्पेशल गेस्ट मौजूद हैं। गेस्ट का इंट्रोडक्शन से पहले मैं ये बताता चलूँ कि आज हमने इस चीज़ पे बिलखुसूस डिस्कशन करनी है कि बैंकिंग सेक्टर किस तरह से इकनॉमिक ग्रोथ में इंस्ट्रूमेंटल हो सकता है और पाकिस्तान के बैंकिंग सेक्टर को क्या पॉलिसीज़ अडॉप्ट करनी चाहिए जो हमारे इकनॉमिक ग्रोथ के लिए कंड्यूसिव हों और वो इकनॉमिक ग्रोथ को, इकनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट के प्रोसेस को आगे लेके चल सके, इंडस्ट्रियल प्रोडक्टिविटी, इंडस्ट्रियल पॉलिसी को इम्प्रूव कर सके। हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर राजा रसिया। ही इज़ मलेशियन इकनॉमिक एडवाइज़र। इसके अलावा ही हैज़ बीन द फॉर्मर डीन फॉर द फैकल्टी ऑफ इकनॉमिक्स एंड एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन यूनिवर्सिटी मलाया एंड he has been on the advisory role of the various governments, including the government of Taiwan. So, Professor, welcome to the show. In fact, I introduced to my audience in Urdu, and then now we have converted to our language, to the English. So, first, welcome to the show, and secondly, in fact, we are keen to know, and a lot of our people are keen to know that how Pakistani's banking sector, which has shown a tremendous growth in the year 2015, year 2016, and in fact in year 2017 as well. So, how this growth of the banking sector can supplement the growth of our economic, our industrial sector, because our banking sector is growing at a very sharp pace, but our industry is not. It's in fact declining. So, what's the reason?
Thank you, Dr. Shujaat. Let me first correct a point though. I'm not a guy who's advised the Taiwanese government, but I use Taiwan as a model in many of my works. Now, coming back to your question, this is actually an old question. At the time when Germany was trying to industrialize, the banks had become powerful. What it meant is that instead of the banking sector supporting industry, it was actually creating problems for industry because the banking sector was focusing a lot more on returns. When industry is evolving, you need a whole range of support. It goes back to the argument that in the early phase, or rather the formative phase of industrialization, you will have primary sectors really subsidizing industry in many ways until you have a situation of the Arthur's Lewis living turning point, then industry takes over. Now, coming back to Pakistan, my own feeling is you have a banking sector that's growing very fast. Now, if you allowed banks to dictate in terms of the kind of interest rates they should charge, it's very likely that industry would not be able to compete for the kind of loans that they have. For a variety of reasons. One of which is you have fairly cheap imports in relation to a fairly strong Pakistani rupee, made strong largely by remittances coming back from abroad, which makes imports not so expensive for domestic importers. So Pakistani industry will have to compete with them. Second, Pakistan hasn't had the infrastructure support required for industry to be able to evolve technologically so that upgrading will allow it to compete with imports.
So, one point here which I wanted to in fact ask from you precisely, that a lot of bankers in Pakistan and a lot of policymakers in Pakistan, they are of the view that in order to start a new business, like the new business startups, they don't need a lot of finance, they don't need a lot of money from the banks. So that's why the thing is that the high interest rate will not affect the business which are going to take place in Pakistan. Whereas if you see the situation in reality, so a lot of people are complaining that due to high cost of financing, we are not able to start our new business. So how do you portray it? So you as the argument you often say by quoting somebody that high interest rate sterilize the new entrepreneurs to they in fact bring the genuine entrepreneurs.
Now that's a fallacy in the sense that reality showed otherwise. Now this is the Korean example. Now coming back to this argument here, you have a scenario where interest rates are likely to be fairly high because Pakistan is a capital scarce country. Interest rates are likely to be fairly high. Second, new entrepreneurs that are coming in are unlikely to have the collateral necessary to fetch that sort of loans. So the capacity of these new firms, I'm not talking about startups that start with industry, with universities, to be able to access loans from banks will be quite low, quite minimal. If you're an entrepreneur in the US, because it's a capital surplus country and the environment there supports with low interest rates, it's very likely that entrepreneurs will be able to access capital fairly easily. Not in a country like Pakistan, very unlikely. Now, that's why we need to have some sort of appraisal committees that offers to underwrite the risks involved. It's like the credit guarantee scheme the Malaysian government introduced. You have a scenario where the government is able to underwrite risk so much and force banks to lend certain portfolio of their loans to those SMEs, small and medium scale industries, at low interest rates, at below, say.
So what it be against the capitalist thoughts that the bank would be saying that we are private and we are a private entity? Why the government is in fact dictating us to give the loans?
This is the case. If you want to promote industry, in the formative years, as I mentioned earlier, the experience of all these countries shows there was some sort of at least indirect subsidization for industry. The only problem here is those countries that managed to provide those loans, and those loans largely translated into success, there was a proper appraisal mechanism to ensure that there was no abuse or minimal abuse. Second, non-performers were quickly taken out of the market. Now, if that can be done, this is the only route which has been successful across the world. Now, over the long run, industry will pay back. It will even subsidize other sectors and so on, including services. Now, unless you have a scenario like that, now we talked about other entrepreneurs. What about startups from universities? If your interest rates are high, it's unlikely that those guys will take the risk to scale up their product. If you don't have incubators, or at least some sort of grants that offers that sort of rent in subsidizing risks. Meaning if you bring in $1, 1 rupee Pakistan, then the government through some sort of grant gives one, but they must make sure there is an appraisal mechanism for it to succeed. Unless you have these things, very little chance of spurring.
So it means that the banking sector alone cannot do something. It means the government has to come itself as well in this process. The one thing which was important here, that do you think that, because a lot of people are saying that the banking sector have grown up and banking sector has attained a tremendous growth, but this banking sector hasn't supplemented the growth in the Pakistani industries. So they are saying that the reason is that the Pakistani industries, in fact, Pakistani banking sector have charged a very high interest rates. They are giving the loans to the industry. Why? Because they are already safe to invest their money in the government securities. So do you think that really this high interest rate of the banks does matter a lot, to the extent that the export of the countries are decreasing and all the industries are at the debacling position?
On the one hand, you have the exchange rates that are not helping industry, because exchange rates remain high because of remittances from abroad, making imports fairly cheap. On the other hand, you do not have the infrastructure support industry requires to be able to upgrade and compete with imports, or even to compete in export markets. Unless you have institutions that are created, or the institutional change that brings about this support that industry requires, also at the same time making sure that performers are in industry, it's unlikely that you will be able to promote. You will have the problem of Dutch disease, created by exchange rates here, as a consequence of remittances flowing into Pakistan. Now, you mentioned about Korea earlier. See, the Korean case, which was misleadingly presented by the Mackinnon-Shaw framework, is the argument then was you had high interest rates. That was the black market rates, the normal rates facing people who were saving money and people who were borrowing money. Now, the state subsidized the big chaebols, subsidized. Of course, the argument then was that because interest rates were high, it was able to sterilize the entrepreneurial market. Only those guys that had high internal rates of returns got into borrowing this money. The performers were in the market, and therefore Korea succeeded. In reality, that was not what happened. In reality, the big chaebols themselves had access to credit at very low interest rates. The government owned all the banks at that time, from 65 to the Plaza Accord 85. The won was fixed, the dollar against the won. Now, what happened was the Korean government cleared the deficit that it had incurred, trade balance deficit, by forcing these firms to export. The Korean government also made sure those who abused the money when they got subsidized credit and used it to lend it to in the black market were sent to jail. The Korean government also removed the non-performers. But the Korean government recognized unless you produce that sort of subsidy for entrepreneurial activity, you cannot make them.
So it means that the Korean government also played a very instrumental role. In
yes,
fact,
in the 70s,
asking about the industrial policy of Pakistan, you have seen the industrial policy of Pakistan right from the 1947 till 2017. So what do you think that our industrial policy is itself, it's a kind of a conducive industrial policy which is going to increase the economic industrial growth and which leads toward the industrial innovation, or there is some issue with the industrial policy of Pakistan as well?
I feel there are a few problems I find. I mean, Pakistan began with the independence in 1947 as a very promising state because the cream of Pakistani intellectual capital were world class, and they remain world class now. But that has not spilled over to the economy as a whole, evolving in such ways to become developed. Now, my points, in the interest of time, I'll just mention two important points here. Firstly, throughout the period of industrial policy, whether it was during military rule, during Ayub Khan, Ziaul Haq, or Musharraf, or whether it was during the civilian governments of Zulkifli Ali Bhutto or Benazir Bhutto, you did not have dynamic industrial policy, in my assessment of it. Dynamic industrial policy would require that policy is evaluated in relation to whether industry is upgrading technologically, whether capabilities were being evolved. Now, unless a state evolves capabilities to compete, globalization will bring a mess for them because you won't be able to compete. You lose resources. Now, industrial policy throughout this entire period did not evolve that, despite the fact the cream of Pakistani intellectual capital remained world class.
Okay. So, drawing from your discussion, you're talking about the globalization. Right now, you have also heard a lot about the China-Pak Economic Corridor, CPEC. So, a lot of people are saying that the CPEC is going to bring a windfall opportunities for the Pakistani business, and it's going to transform our kind of the economy. And I myself, I am a believer that the CPEC is bringing a lot of opportunities, but do you think that the Pakistani industries are ready in order to grab those opportunities which are bringing in shape of the CPEC?
I would like to invoke an important argument that Albert Hirschman advanced before. If you have an opportunity to bring foreign capital, which is likely given Pakistan's structure to have technological capabilities embodied, scarce capital it can bring, it can provide demonstration effect, competition of various kinds. This is an opportunity to build backward linkages at least, backward linkages. Now, this is not manna from heaven in the way classical economists present it, mainstream economists. Liberalize, guarantee profit repatriation, provide security and infrastructure, capital will take care of itself. In the process, it will create jobs, and it will bring welfare gains through wages and so on, as well as linkages eventually. In reality, Hirschman talked about the role of government in making sure that it creates the conditions, it must engender the conditions for the firms to evolve, national firms. In the end, trade integration requires capabilities in Pakistan being built. If it doesn't evolve, those capabilities would not have developed, and therefore they can't compete.
How the government can engender the environment? This was a very important point which you made, that how what kind of the environment you're talking about, that engender the environment?
The first thing is, we now know from the work of some Pakistani papers, which clearly, I'm talking about scientific works that show the immediate effect of trade from CPEC has been massive imports coming from China and very minimal exports going out, which obviously shows that capabilities haven't been evolved here. Now, what the government should do is to see how an institutional framework, talking about the national innovation system, how a triple helix can be introduced. Government, industry, university. All of them have important roles to play. It's how they play. And you need to have science parks, making sure that incubators to scale up activities, so that innovation can be appropriated through the support from these three knowledge nodes I'm mentioning. I hear there's no science parks in Pakistan.
Yeah, there's no such kind of science park here. But what can be the role of the banking sector in all this paradox, like government and academia and industry? So do you think that the banking sector is one which is going to provide the lifeblood, that is the finance to this amalgamation or this venture?
I'm not going to generalize this is something all governments should do. If you have a very small economy that's very tourist driven, it's okay to have the banking sector dictating many things, or what has become of the UK, United Kingdom, where manufacturing has really contracted. Now, if you allow finance capital to dictate in a country that is trying to promote industry, it'll be disastrous.
Okay, so that's a very important point.
Yeah.
So the problem is that in Pakistan, most of this is often the critics are saying that the central bank's role is not very active. The central bank is playing a passive role. So what do you think that the central bank can be instrumental in doing all these things which you have mentioned, or this is the direct government intervention is required to the banks in terms of the credit allocation or to the sectors and into the various type of the firms or the size of the firms?
There has always been this concern people have, both the corporate citizens and the neutral people. They somehow feel if governments get involved, they'll mess it up. They don't know how markets function. They'll be corrupt. They'll look for bribes, distort the whole economy. Now, if that is the scenario to be expected, yes, it's going to destroy the economy. But for economies to evolve, you need dynamic governments who are accountable. You need to have dynamic governments that are accountable to ensure that finance is connected with industry, with the firms that require financing, and at rates that would stimulate innovation, would stimulate upgrading of Pakistan industry so that they can compete in global markets. In an integrated world, even if you're not exporting, you're going to even lose domestic markets because you will have imports, which is what's happening now. So in that sense, it is the finance ministry that should introduce institutional change in terms of how commercial banks should be governed through the central bank, making sure that there is enough finance going into those productive firms, startups and so on, but making sure that those subsidize, whenever the subsidy is involved, there is proper appraisal, so there's no dissipation of those funds.
So again, one more question that's a bit divert from our main topic. That's in Pakistan, our state-owned enterprises, which a lot of firms, big firms, are being operated by the government, including Pakistan International Airline and the Pakistan Steel Mill. The problem is now most of the SOEs are not performing well, not for maybe for 2 or 3 years, for last maybe 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. So what do you think that what is the solution, that whether those SOEs should be privatized or the government has to maybe reformulate the strategy in order to maybe upgrade the efficiency of such sick units?
The examples in the world show it doesn't necessarily mean when organizations are privatized, they perform better. And likewise, it doesn't necessarily show that state-owned enterprises would do better. There are examples of the only difference being that a private entity that is performing badly would be liquidated, would be acquired by other firms, or somehow would be liquidated by litigation. Now, what is important here is, and I can produce an example, Singapore Airlines is state-owned. Singapore Airlines, which is considered a very remarkable performer internationally.
In fact, Pakistan International was having a very remarkable efficiency in 70s and 80s. But
I think what is missing is an appraisal mechanism that is targeted at accountability, making sure that the right guys are performing. It's like the way my own national airlines, Malaysian Airlines, it was one of the world's best airlines. And I believe it's a mismanagement of the airlines that led to its decline, simply because the appraisal mechanism lost its role. And suddenly you have the so-called guys who believe that people with an anchor in private sector would perform better. No, it's just like the Korean bank. From 65 to 85, all banks in Korea were state-owned.
So there's no fixed formula. Thank you very much,
Yes.
Professor Raja Rasia. In fact, we were having a very short of time, but thank you so much for sparing time for us. नाज़रीन, आज हमने कोशिश की कि ज़रा पाकिस्तान जो फॉरेनर हैं या जो फॉरेन इकोनॉमिक एडवाइज़र हैं, जो दूसरी मलेशिया क्योंकि एक बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट वाइटल स्टेक होल्डर है, तो वहाँ के जो इकोनॉमिक एक्सपर्ट्स हैं उनकी पाकिस्तानी इंडस्ट्री के बारे में क्या राय है। ओवरऑल जो मेरी प्रोग्राम में डिस्कशन रही और आपने भी जो सुनी, पाकिस्तान के बारे में हम ज़्यादा मनफी राय रखते हैं लेकिन बाहर के लोगों को बड़ा मुस्बत राय है। एक बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट चीज़ ये भी है कि सारे लोग ये समझते हैं कि हम लोग टैलेंटेड हैं, जो कि वाकई पाकिस्तानी कौम टैलेंटेड कौम है, लेकिन हमें उस अपने टैलेंट को ईमानदारी के साथ, जज्बे के साथ और जोश के साथ और कंसिस्टेंसी के साथ लगाना है मुल्क में, मुल्क की तरक्की के लिए। फिर ये टैलेंट किसी काम का होगा, वरना ये टैलेंट उसी तरह से वेस्ट या फजूल पड़ा रहेगा जिस तरह ये 67 ईयर से पड़ा हुआ है। मुझे इजाज़त दीजिए, अल्लाह हाफ़िज़।